Hey y'all, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be talking about my 2025 job search as a senior software engineer, and we'll be covering my results, my timelines, and how I study for interviews. So the software engineering job market is not what it once was, and yet in January of 2025, I decided to quit my job in search of one that would allow me to work remotely. And in this post, I'll detail my search for remote senior software engineering positions in one of the worst job markets in the past decade. So here's my interview stats, and I tried to make a Sankey diagram to try and make this a little bit easier to parse. And so basically I had about 151 companies that I kind of considered. I sent out 150 applications and had one recruiter that I actually responded to and got into the process with. I personally don't like responding to recruiter inbound, as we'll talk about in a second. So that's why this is so small. I know other people's processes will look a little different. From there, I got 80 no responses. 32 responded to me, but basically said, we don't care, so no interviews. 9 that ended up being mismatched roles, usually because they want a specific technology like Ruby on Rails, or they weren't actually remote, even though the listing said they were. And then 30 that I was actually in the interview process with. Of those 30, 15 I decided to not continue at some point in the process, usually because there was another offer on the table that I wanted more, and so it didn't make sense to continue. 8 where they declined me, usually because I failed an interview. 2 where they filled the role already, so these are cases where I passed the interview, they want me to join the company, but that specific role changed, and maybe I just decided to not continue with the different roles. And then 5 were actually got an offer for the role itself. So that's it from a general high level, and we'll talk about some specifics here in a minute. Okay, some notes about this. So my process is to cast a very wide net and then narrow down as I go. I feel like I'm already doing the studying for interviews, so I might as well just check out all my options, because adding an additional company is only a little bit, but if I spread out all the companies that I might be interested in over time, then I have to continually keep studying, but might as well kind of leverage that time, especially when I'm really good at interviews, to check out all the possible options that I have. And some anecdote is that I found that typically one of my top 3 going in, I go into a job search, I have an idea of the kind of company I want to join, and probably have a few that I picked out as top candidates. One of those does tend to remain a top choice throughout the entire process, but at least one other of my tops usually come from a company I didn't expect and so wasn't there, and if I hadn't cast a wide net, I would have never found them, and sometimes that's the one that I end up taking. And so if 150 applications seems high, I would say it probably is. I don't know how many other people are actually sending out this many apps, but this is kind of by design, because this is how I like to go through interview processes. On the flip side, I know a few people that literally interviewed at 2 places via referrals, and they got both of them, and so there's a wide range here, I think, of what is possible when looking for these kinds of roles. Second thing is, I do not respond to inbound recruiters. I know a lot of people do get jobs fine with inbound recruiters, and for smaller companies, this might actually be the only kind of recruiter they have, and therefore if I'm not responding to them, I really have no choice to even get in their process. But I personally think that this is a very easy way to get scammed, and instead I typically like to apply to the official website and wait for a recruiter to get back to me from there. This makes me feel more comfortable that they're actually official, that they're actually responding to an application that I put in. I kind of know what their domain is and stuff. I've checked out this company because I personally think about joining them. And I think this just avoids all the different kind of scamming things where it's you think they're a recruiter, and then they put you in touch with someone, you think they're actually at a company, and then they actually are just trying to get your info. There's a big thing about this a few years ago where a dozen people got scammed thinking that they were applying and going through the process at Splunk, but actually they had never talked to anyone at Splunk at all. And so for me, this just feels better anyway, and honestly, a lot of the inbound is kind of just random companies I wouldn't even consider applying to. So that's something I do. Doesn't work for everyone, but something I like to do. I'm going to call out the decent number of role mismatches. So here there was 9, and I just think that companies seem to be looking for specific technology experience more than previous cycles. It's pretty common for startups to do this. They don't have many people, they want you to be able to hit the ground running, and so they might be we need someone who knows TypeScript and React, That's pretty common, but this cycle in particular, I've seen more companies that are larger that are looking for very specific technologies, and so I think they're trying to, again, make it more clear that you need to hit the ground running. So I had a few companies like this, like Ruby on Rails is just something I've never used in the past, so if they really want someone who's really good at that, then it didn't work out. And then I'll also say that there's less remote roles now, and a lot of companies that used to be remote friendly are no longer remote friendly, but they maybe haven't like updated their job postings or their recruiting sites. And so I applied thinking that it would be remote friendly, but it turns out actually they're moving away from that due to RTO. And so that was another, big portion of these companies. Roles already filled. So these were times when a role was already filled before I got through the process, or I passed the process and they chose someone else instead. And I'll say 2 is more than I'd seen previously before 2023, but in my 2023 job searches, I did see a lot more of those, like 5. And when I see a lot of these cases where you like pass the interviews, but you still don't get chosen, to me, it just seems like there's a really stacked pipeline. So a lot more demand, especially quality demand for a specific job than there are the supply of jobs. And so that's what it looks like to me. And I think because there was actually less of those these times, I see that as a good signal that the job market is actually improving a bit. So all in all, I think this is like a good sign. I will note that some people probably see like the role already filled as like a potential rejection. And I think that's fair, like you weren't the one that came out on top, but there's nothing you can really do, I think, if someone else finishes the pipeline before you, or if you pass all the, standards, but they just choose someone else. So I choose to have them in a slightly separate bucket than like you failed the interview. Another thing to call out is that the job market is spiky. So there are more software engineering jobs than there were in 2023. And so I do think there's a lot of openings, and this is like a pretty decent market for software engineers. But I will say that these openings are biased heavily to in-office due to the massive trend towards return to office, and so are really clustered around hub cities. So this is going to be like New York, Bay Area, Seattle, and then there's a few others in like tier 2s around the nation. And so in those hubs, I think it's a great market to be a software engineer. On the flip side, I would say remote work openings are decreasing by a lot. And I'm a big fan of remote work. And so unfortunately, I had a pretty rough market, although better than I think in 2023. But if you're open to, in-office work in a hub city, I think you have a really strong chance of getting a decent job with decent pay for software engineering. Also, if you're looking for remote work as a software engineer, I compiled a list of 66 companies hiring remote software engineers this year. And these are all pre-vetted by me in the past several months because, I had to talk to recruiters and see if they're actually hiring, if they had openings and stuff. And so these are the companies that I found. All right, interview results over time. And so this chart here is basically showing like each bar, I guess, is an interview, whether it's like an actual interview at a company or an interview question that I'm doing studying. And red means that I failed that question, green means that I passed it, and blue means that I passed it well. Green means I passed it well, blue means I passed it. And the way that I use this for myself really is to just understand, like, am I studying enough, or do I have like big gaps in when I was studying? And where am I failing? So if I start failing a lot, like here, like I should look into what this clump of failures is because it probably indicates some areas that I need to work on more. And by forcing myself to record each question, it's just like it kind of gamifies it a little bit and kind of makes me feel like, 2 questions a day isn't all for just like nothing. It's like actually building towards something. And kind of forces me to do a slight little reflection after each question to really think about like, if I did this in an interview, would I have passed myself? Would I have passed very well? Or would I have probably failed myself? Which I think helps to calibrate like internally where I think I should be at. So that hopefully I can course correct before I get to the next interview. And so the duration was basically 2 months from when I started like applying to taking my offer. The time spent in interviews and studying was about 88 hours. There's about 65 interviews that I took. This is not including HR talks or HR screens. There's going to be like a ton of little ones there, but they're not really like testing you for anything. So really I'm just looking at interviews here. And then my interview success rate was about 93% passing, and then 37% where I felt like I definitely passed that, like I crushed it. And then for all question success rate, it was a little bit lower at 88% passing, and then 44% passed confidently. The pass confidently stuff is like very subjective. It's just like how I personally feel that my performance went. But I do think this is like a good thing to try and calibrate. And I've now done, hundreds of interviews myself. I've now interviewed people hundreds of times. And so I feel like my calibration is pretty decent at this point. So something I track, but may not be useful for anyone else. For an actual timeline, I actually started studying or thinking about studying back in November of 2024. And then, when I finally decided decided to give my notice and stuff, I started to study seriously and take interviews in January of 2025. And then I finally took the offer and kind of stops my interview process in March. And so overall, 2 months from start to offer, but I often do have like a month or two before that where I'm like thinking about starting maybe. but I haven't actually pulled the trigger yet. So yeah, I like to keep a log of all my study and interview questions and how I do. This helps me track if I'm studying enough and where I'm having problems so I can course correct throughout the process. Like if I'm feeling rusty one day and I kind of look and it's like, oh yeah, I've only studied like twice in the past few weeks, like, that keeps me honest and helps me know that if I don't want to be rusty, I probably need to do more than that. And I already mentioned this, but I do find it to be slightly motivating as it helps me to gamify the process. Kind of like I need to do 2 questions a day. All right, I'll complete it. It's checked off my, today's quest list. And now I have a log of all the times I kind of hit it as well. Now looking back, it also helps to keep my failures in perspective. Like there will be failures. No matter how much I prepare, I'm always going to fail a few things, whether it's because I wasn't ready for this question or I'm just having an off day or just like couldn't do it. Like you can come fully prepared and still fail, and that's going to happen. And that hurts, but I think seeing it in perspective does lessen the impact a bit, because I can kind of go back and like, okay, I failed one today, but I feel like I did well on like 4 of them. And then if I look back, I've got a few failures, but look how many like successes there were, kind of drowning it out, which to me helps lessen the burden of that. And my general study routine is basically to do 1 of these each day. For coding interviews, I just do leak code and I try to do 2 mediums in under 20 minutes each, and preferably like back to back, because this is kind of how real interviews are going to be. For system design, I try to do 1 to 2 popular system design questions, either on paper or in Excalibur, going through the full process, drawing it out and stuff like that. And then behavioral, I try for about 40 minutes of answering behavioral questions out loud. And the common theme here is basically trying to simulate what it's like to be in an actual interview and then keep iterating on that. And over time, you just get really comfortable with this and your answers, and you've seen the patterns of things, and so generally it tends to start working out all right. And generally the pattern I expect is to start off pretty slow with a small amount of iterations and relatively high fail rate. And this is just me, getting back on the horse. Leak code is a skill and you don't really use it during most day-to-day things, so you do have to kind of brush it off and get better at it again. And then once I start interviewing, I kind of ramp up my iteration load and then start targeting my issue areas to turn them into passes. And then finally, by the end of the process, I'm interviewing spikily as I go from final round to final round and expect to hit mostly passes here. And you can kind of see that here, like, I started off in kind of like November, but I really only studied like 3 times in November, maybe like 4 or 5 times in December. And then finally, when I decided back in January, I'm like way more consistent, doing 2 to 3 questions a day. And then when I actually start interviewing, I'm up to like, 4 to 5, but I've still got these kind of spotty failures in here. And then when you start to get to the end where I'm like pretty warmed up, we've got a lot less failures here, but I'm doing much more spikely because, you get these like 5 a day. This is like almost definitely a final round, and then you're tired, so maybe I'll take a day off or only study a little bit, and then you've got like a few more final rounds, then nothing, then a few final rounds, then nothing, then a final rounds. So that's generally the pattern that I've seen in this job search and then my previous job searches as well. And this pattern is one of the reasons that I interview at so many places and push my top companies to the end of the process. The first places help me practice and calibrate for the current cycle. Every cycle has this like a slightly different things that they're asking or questions and stuff, kind of trends across companies. And so by the time I get to my top places, after getting through interviews, seeing those patterns, I'm usually at my peak performance for that cycle. This does lead to some awkward timing sometimes. Like in particular, smaller companies interview a lot faster. They are often done in about 3 weeks if you keep pushing forward. And then larger companies interview much slower. There's rarely a large company that finishes before 4 weeks. And so, at the extreme, you start a small company earlier and then you start a large company later. And now there's like maybe weeks in between when you might get an offer in one and an offer at another, which can be awkward. And so I don't really have a solution for this. Sometimes this just happens just because of logistics. And the best thing I can say is like try to be upfront with your recruiters about your expected timing and try to schedule the initial rounds accordingly. But at some point, there's only so many hours in the day and you can't control the logistics on their side. And so sometimes this is just going to happen. All right, so how do I schedule interviews? So software engineering interview processes typically have 3 stages. So there's the HR screens. This is just talking to HR to see if it's a good fit. This is 30 to 45 minutes. And really, I'm talking about the first HR screen. You're going to be talking through HR throughout the process. But really, the only one that's like a test is the first one. Then you have some tech screens. This is usually like coding screens to see if you can code or just have basic technical skills for the role. Sometimes this is just a coding screen. Sometimes they'll also throw in a system design. But usually there's like 1, maybe 2 rounds of these that each take about like an hour. And then you finally have your final rounds, which is typically going to cover coding, system design, and behavioral to just kind of see how you stack up against the company's hiring bars. And this is generally where most of the signal is going to come from for whether you're going to get hired or not. I guess one more that I kind of left out here that is relatively common is there will be a hiring manager in a lot of companies. Sometimes this is a screen, sometimes this is at the final round, but it's basically just a behavioral that's more targeted towards this role itself. And these usually take about 3 to 5 hours to do the final rounds, depending on how many rounds they have inside of there. So most large companies do follow this pattern, with some smaller companies having less rounds, often splitting up the final round into single interviews, so they screen you throughout the process. I saw this more this time than previous interviews that I've done, where they kind of took, like, let's say a system design or a hiring manager off of the final round and then did it a few weeks earlier, so it acted more like a screen. And then when the final round came, you didn't have that on that day. I guess kind of an easier way to like weed people out and not waste people's time if you can't even pass this. And so here's what a typical week looks like for me. I know it's kind of hard to see. There's like a lot of colors and it's like very busy, but this is kind of how I block my days out. And so the interviews are kind of this yellow color, but not these. This just tells me to get up. And so, I've got like on Monday, I've got 2 tech screens and then an HR screen. And then on Tuesday, I've got 2 tech screens and then 3 HR screens, or 3 HR talks, whatever you want to call it. On Wednesday, looks like I had 1 HR and then 2 rounds of screens. And this might have been a final round that was split up. I can't remember. And then on Thursday, I had 2 HR screens, or I guess 3 HR screens and then 1 tech screen. And then on Friday, I had 1, what I think is either a tech screen or an HR screen, and then a final round. And so in general, my system for scheduling interviews is like only schedule them in the afternoons. This gives me the mornings for studying or preparing whatever I needed to do that day that's not interviewing. And then usually this means by the afternoon, I'm like ready to actually go. I try to schedule my HR and tech screens earlier in the week and then my final rounds later. This kind of lets me warm up on the typically easier interviews, which are the screens, so that I'm really ready for those final rounds when they come. And then my final rule is like to limit 2 tech screens or 1 final per day. And this is just to try to give myself some breathing room between interviews so that I don't accidentally like fail just because I didn't give myself time in the day or like enough breaks or anything like that. And I found that 2 tech screens or 1 final per day is like a sweet spot for both scheduling things in so you can get through all of them, but also giving yourself the room to, practice and debrief if you had a bad day or whatever. Now this works for me because for, 3 of the 4 past job searches that I've done, I haven't had a job at the time. And so this means that I can devote my entire week towards interviewing and I don't have to work around other work commitments. But I will note that this won't work for everyone, and I'm not even sure I would recommend this to most people. But for me, this seems to be the easiest way to go about it, and so that's kind of what I've done for a lot of my job searches. All right, finally, some interview types I saw. So I got a few questions about the types of interviews I saw this round, so putting them here. So for technical, the main ones are still leak code, still used very frequently, and they're typically mediums. I don't think I saw hard this whole process, and I definitely saw some easies. And so something to keep in mind. That said, I didn't really go through FANG this time because FANG's kind of turned off most of their remote work. And I, wasn't really looking for non-remote positions. And so maybe if I was going for FANG or maybe high frequency trading companies, they might still be sending out hards pretty regularly. So something to keep in mind. For system design, still pretty regular. And I do think it's more and more important as I get more senior and something I kind of put more time into preparing for. And then the last bucket for technical is real world coding, which this has been present in previous cycles that I've done, but I think this is the cycle that I've seen this the most. And it really comes down to 3 different buckets of these, where one is like build a web API that does something. Another is integrate with an existing web API to do something. And then the third is basically read some files that they give you, do some operations on it, and write new files. It's kind of like the 3 archetypes that I saw, and they can be mixed together a bit. And I saw this one pretty frequently, and so what I did is I built myself a TypeScript template to kind of make this stuff easier for me, so I wasn't fumbling around trying to set up like, a TS config. And so my recommendation is definitely like build something like this for yourself in whatever language you're using that you're very comfortable with, because you will see these coding interviews throughout the process. Finally, behavioral, which I think is, also increasingly important as I get more senior. And really there's like 5 areas they're looking at: their project impact, how do you manage projects, and especially across different teams and stakeholders? How do you manage or resolve conflicts? How much mentorship do you do? And then kind of examples of company values that you have. I found for the examples of company values, AI is actually pretty useful for this, because you can kind of feed in the values and get it to ask you questions around the values, because they're not always going to be like, give me an example of value. They'll ask you a question with a kind of undertone of like, oh, they're going for this value. And so I thought AI was actually pretty useful for coming up with example questions like that. Next. So interviews aren't a very fun thing to do, but they are necessary if you want to change jobs, and sometimes it's just time to switch. This is the general system that I've used for my last 4 job searches, and so hopefully it helps you as well. Now, I'll share more about where I landed and what I'm up to in the next few months, but for now, I'm going to focus on onboarding and getting a lay of the land. But once I feel solid there, more to come. I didn't realize this, but I was kind of looking back at my previous job search posts, and I actually have done a pretty decent job of documenting all of these. And so if you're interested in those, I have them linked here. So 2016 was my first job out of college, which took me about 157 hours. 2019 was my second job where I joined Meta, which was 153 hours. 2022 is when I left Meta for about 51 hours. And then 2023, which I didn't really write much about this one, took me about 67 hours. And then 2025, which is this one, took me about 88 hours. So if you're interested in any of these, you can find the links here to learn more about them. And if you like this post, you might also like, how do you know it's time to quit your job? You might also be interested in how to find a fulfilling career, no matter what you're into. And finally, my career as a software engineer so far, 6 years of experience, ex-Meta and ex-founder. This is about 2 years old now. For the most part, it covers it. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.